Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Scott Silverman. I'm one of the co-founders of CommerceNext. We're a community event series and conference for marketers at retail and DTC brands. On behalf of my co-founders, Veronica Sansev and Alan Dick, welcome to our regular webinar series. Today, our topic is how to reduce e-commerce technical debt and maintain a great customer experience. So this is a little different than our typical webinar, which were generally focused more on front-end topics like marketing and customer experience, and we're going to get a little deeper on technology. We all know marketing and customer experience could not function without technology, which was why we're glad you're all here with us today. As we were promoting this event, it was great to see all the positive comments from folks on LinkedIn and via email about us covering this topic. So we're glad we can do that. So as always, we'll be taking questions. Feel free to be thinking of those as we're going through the opening presentation and during the panel discussion. But really, thank you for tuning in and making the time to join live or listen to our replay. So I want to start with a few important thank yous. First, I want to thank our speakers. We couldn't do this without them. Today, we have Matt Powell, who's the CTO of FTD, Michelle Garvey. You'll be hearing a little bit more about her background, and she's been a CIO at a number of large retailers. She's senior advisor at Alvarez and Marsal. Kelly Goetsch, he is chief strategy officer at Commercetools. Richard Mins, who's group commerce CTO at Capgemini. And I'm excited to moderate. And again, looking forward to an interactive conversation, taking lots of questions from our audience. We recognize how busy the speakers are and how grateful we are for them taking the time to share their insights with our audience. So we are going to be sending a nice gift, compliments of Gift Now to all of the speakers, plus 5 lucky attendees who will be selected randomly will also be getting a gift. So you need to be listening live to qualify for as one of the attendees for the gift. And I want to give a big thank you to CommerceTools for sponsoring today's webinar. We could not bring these webinars to our audience and all the insights that come with them without the support of our sponsors. It's been a pleasure working with Kelly and the Commerce team's tool on the webinar, and I really appreciate them supporting this topic on behalf of our community. So as far as the agenda for today, I'm going to talk about a couple things that are coming up at CommerceNext. We are going to have our session from Kelly talking about identifying e-commerce technical debt and sources of it and what to do about it. And then we're going to have some audience poll questions, kind of hear what you're all thinking. And then finally, bring in our panel, FTD, or Matt, Michelle, and Rich. And we'll take audience questions throughout that. So as far as some of the things that are coming up, our next webinar is going to be almost a month away on Wednesday, September 14th. We're going to help you get prepared for the 2023 holiday season. I know it doesn't feel very holiday-like right now, but it's coming up. It's the Holiday 22 Retail Forecast, what to expect, how to prepare, where to succeed. We have Marie Ippolita, Michelle Kors, Stephen Winnick from CoreSite Research, and it's going to be moderated by my fellow co-founder, Alan Dick from CommerceNext. Also, we have been publishing and dropping a lot of podcasts. There was a lot of recordings we caught at CommerceNext at the end of June. So don't miss this new one. We have a great conversation. It's an interview with Darren Hall, who's the president of Vera Bradley, and Andrea Moore, who's the SVP of e-commerce at Nest New York. They're going to talking about maintaining being customer obsessed. And then we have a whole bunch of others. These are just a little bit of an example. Folks at Brilliant Earth, Jenny Kane, again, just wherever you find your favorite podcast, you'll see the whole list of all of those, and feel free to tune in and listen to some of that great content. So if you have missed any of our past events, don't worry. we have you covered with our YouTube channel. So I encourage you to go there. There are, at this point, hundreds of sessions, interviews of e-commerce executives, a whole variety of topics that are been covered. And it's a great resource. You can learn about just about anything going on in the industry. So I encourage you to go and check out the YouTube channel. If you, as far as housekeeping goes, don't worry about missing anything on this webinar. We're recording it. We'll make it available, a replay of it by tomorrow. And then I just want to show you where a couple things are on the screen. So everything is on your upper right. You'll see Q&A, polling. You can chat with other audience members. So if you go to the chat, feel free to high five our speakers or make some comments about some things that you heard, get some conversation going with your fellow attendees. If you want to ask questions to the speakers, and we'll start incorporating those into the panel discussion later on in the webinar, you can use the Q&A feature. Just ask your question there. You can then go and hit the thumbs up to upvote any questions that you see. That'll help us prioritize which ones we want to prioritize for the speakers to cover. And then there's a number of handouts, Kelly's presentations in there, and there's some great white papers from both CommerceTools and Capgemini on headless commerce and technical debt. Encourage you to go and check out those handouts and download those so you have that as well. And for those who are listening on the replay, you can get all of that with that little disk drive looking thing on the bottom right there. So it's not instant poll time, but we are going to be doing that in a little bit. So with that, I would like to bring up Kelly Goetsch from CommerceTools, have him talk about e-commerce technical debt. Welcome, Kelly. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So should I just get started? I guess so. My presentation is going to be about tech debt, what it is, how to avoid it, how to solve it. A lot of parallels there to financial debt that I'll get into as well, for better or worse. As Scott mentioned, I am Chief Strategy Officer of CommerceTools. And a little bit of background on me, so you kind of know where I'm coming from. I started my career with ATG, which was the leading commerce platform back in the 90s and 2000s. And Oracle actually just formally killed off that entire product this week. So kind of sad to see that era over with at this point. I also spent 2.5 years as the chief ATG architect at Walmart. So had a lot of experience doing failed production deployments and getting paged at midnight trying to figure out why something was down. I have all those scars from my 20s of those years, and I think it actually made me stronger as a technologist, having dealt with that first wave of commerce platforms. I then went to Oracle, where I led Java Cloud Service, microservices, Exalogic, worked with a lot of the different cloud services there. I also wrote e-commerce in the cloud and married up my love of commerce with cloud. And then 6 years ago, actually 6 years as of Monday, I joined CommerceTools as CPO and very recently moved over to Chief Strategy Officer. Wrote 3 more books there, co-founded and ran, and now I'm chairman of the Mock Alliance. And I've really found my home. There are very few folks out there doing what we're doing, and very pleased to be on the forefront of this entire space. With that, let's go through tech debt. So a gentleman named Ward Cunningham, he was actually one of the co-authors of the Agile Manifesto. He coined the term tech debt back in 1991, and he talks about it just like you would speak about financial debt. It's something that you could do sooner than you might have otherwise until you have to pay back the money with interest, right? It's taking out a loan basically. And that's what tech debt is. When you really step back and look at it, the question is with tech debt, how much interest do you have to pay back, right? Are we talking 30% interest, or are we talking 2% interest? Those are obviously pretty big differences. And sometimes you need to take out debt, right? Like if you're buying a house, for example, that's probably good debt to be taking out, generally speaking, right? But if you're, and I'll get this into the subsequent slide, but if you're paying gambling debt, that's probably not good debt to be taking out, right? It depends on the purpose, why you're doing it. And there are multiple forms of tech debt. The first is architecture, and you could just be choosing the wrong architecture. That's pretty straightforward. Maybe you should be using microservices, but instead you've decided to start with a giant monolith, for example, right? That's an example of architecture debt. Another is people, and that is hiring the wrong people. Maybe you hire too many junior folks, for example, and not enough senior folks. Another is process. So maybe in early days of going live, you just ship everything to production immediately, and there isn't a whole lot of process there. And later you have to go back and you have to add more process around your CI and CD tooling, for example. There's also documentation. I mean, how often do we start by building something and then later write the documentation for that? So there's, obviously some debt there. The biggest source of tech debt is code, right? People just writing poor code, and that happens all the time for various reasons. Some of it's intentional and some of it's unintentional, which I'll talk about in a minute. There's also infrastructure. Maybe you start on-prem, but then move to cloud later. Or, maybe you start with, self-hosted everything in EC2 and then move to a managed Kubernetes offering like EKS or GKE. That's a form of debt. Or maybe you go from single cloud and later you have to adopt multi-cloud. Right? Those are all forms of infrastructure debt. And again, some of them are intentional, some of them are unintentional. And finally, there's tooling. There are a lot of great systems on the market these days that allow you to optimize your code. And if you're not using them, something like Jellyfish, for example, which is pretty popular out there, you then later have to go back and adopt those tools. And it's not just a matter of technically adopting them. That's one part of it. A big part of it is also the process and the culture. And if you suddenly layer on some new tool like Jellyfish, all of a sudden you now have to go back and change your organization and change the incentives and change the way people work. And it's a lot harder to change something after the fact than it is when you start. So tech debt can take many, many forms, and it's all largely the same in the end. As I mentioned on the 2 slides ago, there are 2 basic types of tech debt. So one is good debt, right? And we all have debt to some degree. And debt could be something like a mortgage, right? If you're buying your first house, you want to take out some debt, and that's good. It helps improve your credit score, and you can pay back the principal in a nice, fixed amount of money every month, very stable, and that's expected, and that's fine. Also things like student loan debt in certain circumstances, that's a reasonably good form of debt, as long as you're able to pay it back. Car loans, the average car price these days is $50,000 or $60,000. So there are good forms of debt, and that's fine. But there are also bad forms of debt as well. And some of that is because of poor decisions. Some of it is mistakes. Some of it is desperation. Think of payday loans there. Think of title loans. Those are all very high interest, corrosive forms of debt. And what's nice about a good debt is typically it's for something positive, something you have to spend a lot of money on, but over time you can incrementally pay that back with relatively low interest in a fixed, dependable schedule. Whereas with bad forms of loans, you can have some people chasing you and break your legs or something, right? Like generally these are not stable long-term loans that you pay back incrementally. A payday loan is something you have to pay back next week with really, really high interest. That's not a good form of debt. And I think a lot of that is just a form of poor decision making in many cases. It's because you're not able to budget and look at the trade-offs. And it's the type of debt that rapidly spirals out of control and compounds. And tech debt can take both of these forms. You can have a good, well-reasoned trade-off to say, we're going to go live and document something later because we have to go live right now. Or the bad form of debt is, we're just going to fix up a company before we sell it to the next PE firm, right? That's a bad form of tech debt. And then let the next team go deal with the problems as a result of that. Another might be just going with the absolute lowest cost possible vendor on the SI side, just to get something done and out the door and tick the checkbox. But it's not implemented very well. Think of it like building a house, right? You can build a house to last 500 years, or you could build a house essentially out of cardboard and the finish is poor and it's going to collapse after 50 years, right? That's how you can build IT systems. And I think there's a good medium between those two. And I'll go through, I think this image on the right is very representative of tech debt, right? You can pick two of these things. You can have something be good and cheap, but not fast. And you can have something be cheap and fast, but not good, right? You can have something be good and fast, but not cheap. And I think it's the same with software development, right? You can't have it all. And in many cases, there are real financial forces that force people to make bad trade-offs. I'll go through a couple of them. The first is having your sales and marketing go way ahead of your product. And we're starting to see startups now completely collapse as a result of this mindset. When money was free back in 2021, last year, a lot of folks out there raised money, spent a lot of that money on sales and marketing, but they didn't actually have a product to ship. And we see the same thing on the brand and retail side as well. It's folks building out products or building out sales and marketing long before they actually have a product to build. And that's bad because then when you do manage to sign up those first big customers, then they end up dictating your entire roadmap to you. Another challenge is hiring too many low-skill developers. And I see this all the time. In newer technology, it's better to hire relatively fewer, relatively higher skilled folks, because you're basically plumbing together these different components, these best of breed components. You're not building everything from scratch like you used to. So having the wrong resourcing model is a big source of tech debt, and people end up writing a lot of very bad code as a result of that. Another one, poor product management. If you have customers just completely dictating what you write, what software you write, that's a problem. That leads to debt. Another challenge that I see a lot is folks building things that should be purchased from third parties. So I see people build their own DNS, their own load balancers, their own CDNs, their own container management platform. People build their own shopping carts from scratch. There's no reason to buy any of that stuff or to build any of that stuff from scratch. It makes much more sense to take something off the shelf, right? These things are all quite commoditized at this point. And there are good vendors that offer these discrete pieces of functionality for relatively low cost. And it doesn't make sense to build these things when they're not differentiating you. Another is the ship it mentality, right? F it, ship it. And I see a lot of that in Silicon Valley, especially, which is, just move fast, break things. I think that's the ethos of Silicon Valley. And I think if you've got a startup funded for 6 months, you probably have to get something to market very quickly. But if you have something to market for 6 months, you're not going to be able to then scale and build on top of that as a long-term foundation without making really, really big, substantial investments in re-architecture in the future. And that's painful. Another thing I see a lot is weak leaders being pressured by their boards and by their investors to deliver quick wins. And especially if a new leader is brought in, typically at the C-level, they need to get stuff out the door immediately. And the investors don't particularly care if something isn't documented or if it's on the wrong infrastructure or the code is poorly written. What they care about is, I talked about this a lot. It's box checking. It's a box checking exercise is really what it comes down to. And they can check the box. They say the feature is out, but it's a very poorly written feature. And that's the problem. Another challenge is a lack of long-term ownership. And what I've seen out there is folks using companies to build a whole commerce solution from scratch, and they build the big empire, and they use that then to go get a promotion and a job elsewhere. And the next person to take over that role is left dealing with the mess. So people build all sorts of stuff. They, can put on their resumes that they got live in 14 months, and they had a team of 500 people and everything was great. And that's generally not the problem. The problem is 2 years after that, when you have all the tech debt that you've created, and those people are the management who did that are long gone on their next job doing the same thing somewhere else. It's empire builders using companies to gain career advantage. And I've seen quite a few of those examples out there, and it's really dishonest, and I don't like it. And then finally, another source is building for a single cloud, but then going multi-cloud or switching cloud vendors. If you're all in on AWS is a great cloud, but let's say, AWS starts to raise their fees, or, you have a tighter partnership with Google, or you need to go multi-cloud to reach a specific region. You have to switch clouds, and switching clouds is really difficult to do. So it's best to start multi-cloud from the very beginning so that you can switch clouds. But yeah, it's very challenging. And I think there are a lot of shortcuts people can take to get things out the door, but then they're not necessarily aware of the consequences. And there are quite a few business consequences as well as a result of this. These just aren't technology problems. The first is poor performance. We see a lot of that. And I'll give you a good example of that. Every single vendor out there says, oh, just insert this JavaScript tag in your front end and it's zero overhead. Well, if you insert 50 of those tags over the course of 10 years, which I see a lot of, that itself becomes a problem, and it causes performance issues, right? There's no such thing as zero overhead. There's always overhead, always overhead. Next is cost, right? Things just cost a lot of money. And at some point, it becomes too cost prohibitive to build anything, and you have to start over from scratch. So I've seen that as well. Another is just a complete inability to release. And you get to the point where your tech debt becomes so bad, it's the equivalent of declaring bankruptcy, right? You just say, look, I cannot do what you're asking me to do. I can't build that feature. It doesn't work. And they can't build it because the system is just so old and so creaky and so terrible that they can't do it. And I'll give you a good example of that. A lot of the unemployment systems across the US were strained due to COVID, because all of that had to be done through unemployment, those unemployment payments, and the systems literally couldn't handle it. I mean, there are some states where unemployment checks never went out just because the systems literally could not be touched anymore. There are also a lot of retailers, by the way, who were never able to implement buy online, pick up in store because their systems were so old and legacy and rigid. And over time, they just get calcified, right? That tech debt becomes built up over time. It calcifies, and you just can't do anything. There are also outages, that you see as a result of this. And the system becomes so big and so fragile that it just can't stay up. And then finally, and I guess the biggest one, is all of these things lead to just decreased revenue. It's pretty clear who's leading digitally. It's pretty clear who's not. And ultimately, you end up with all of these issues causing declining revenue. And I think the biggest source of decreased revenue is the opportunity cost of not having cool new features. And I'm a big believer in innovation requiring iteration. You have to iterate on features multiple times, 2, 3, 4 times before they start generating any revenue. And if you're able to release to production once a quarter, it could easily take you a year before you're able to get a feature out and generating revenue. And you lose a lot of money in that year, a lot of money. As a result, your revenue goes down. Like, you need to be able to release things constantly to production. And you can fix tech debt. It's hard. It's always hard. A lot of it is stakeholder management. You have to create a shared vocabulary as an organization, and you have to be able to quantify the debt, just like you can with financial debt, right? If you take out a mortgage, they tell you what the interest rate is, what your monthly payment is, right? It's quantified. But in many cases, if you're taking a very big IT decision, there's no quantification of the debt. And I think that should be part of the decision process. When you make a big decision, like, do we go monolith or do we go microservices? Do we go single cloud? Do we go multi-cloud? The other side of that should be modeled out and it should be quantified. And you should say, look, if we don't go multi-cloud from the very beginning, this is going to cost us 500 hours a year from now. Do we want to budget for that? Another thing is, like I said, just budgeting for it. It's really important that you, as you go forward as a product management team, budget for technical debt. And at CommerceTools, we did that. We still do that. We had an entire year once where, and it wasn't because the system was poorly written or anything else, but it was almost a 25x, by the way, increase in traffic over the course of 18 months. And as a result of that, we were just having issues with things like logging, for example. The logging infrastructure didn't scale. The monitoring had to be redone. Our database infrastructure and the auto scaling there needed to be upgraded. So we had to go through, and again, it's not dead. It's not like we made a mistake. It's just that we had to acknowledge and budget for it. And we spent the better part of an entire year. We spent most of 2019 rebuilding a lot of the core infrastructure. And now we're in a great spot. We spend maybe 5% of our time servicing tech debt. But the key is at CommerceTools, we have a way, we put it on the roadmap, and we have a way to quantify it. And then finally, you need an ownership mentality. If you have people cycling in and out, every year or every 2 years, they don't care. They're going to build stuff, ship it, put it on their resume that they did it, and move on. They're not going to get harshly judged for having that debt. And where I see organizations really excel is if they have people who are there for many years and they are responsible for the debt that they create, they tend not to create as much of it. So I think it's very important to do that. All right. Now, if you could please ask questions through the system, and we will switch over to a panel discussion. Over to you, Scott.
Great. Thanks, Kelly. Maybe one day after this webinar, people, instead of putting on LinkedIn all the things they released, they'll like how much technical debt they reduced. So we'll help everyone with that today. So we want to start, get a little bit of a sense of where everyone is from our audience. So we have some poll questions. The way that these work, there you'll see there in the polling, there's open and closed. So they'll pop up on your screen. So why don't we just jump right in? Here is the first question. How would you describe your current e-commerce technical debt? Software license that may not be optimized or utilized fully. Is that you're fully utilizing all your e-commerce software, there's no waste going on. The second option is you don't have a full understanding of whether or not you may be underutilizing some software investments, so there's some blind spots there. Or you're underutilizing software, you just can't remove the cost for the time being. It looks like the majority of everyone is dealing, they know they're underutilizing software, they just can't remove those costs for the time being. We're seeing a little bit that have some blind spots. Very few feel like they're fully utilizing their software right now. So let's go to our second question. And we're going to get more into this topic in a moment, but how would you describe the relationship between IT and marketing at your company? So everything's great, full simpatico. It's a great partnership is the first choice. B, strong collaboration, but there's some areas for improvement. C, getting there and an interest in making the partnership better. D, you're not a great situation. You coexist with a fair amount of friction. So let's see where everybody is with the relationship between IT and marketing at your company. So this is a little more evenly distributed. The number one answer is strong collaboration, but areas for improvement, followed by getting there and an interest in making the partnership better. Although 14% coexist with a fair amount of friction. And 5% is saying it's great, full simpatico. All right, so go to our next question. How clear, again, and we're going to be talking more about why this is important, but how clear is the vision for your e-commerce business over the next 2 to 3 years? I'm sure there's a lot of answers. I try to pick a few that might be most popular. The organization is fully aligned on a clear vision. B, you're working towards a vision with all the stakeholders, but you're not quite there yet. C, a vision is being crafted, but not all stakeholders are involved. Or D, little alignment, different groups have their own vision, they're doing their own thing. Number one answer is you're working towards a vision with all the stakeholders. That's good, but not quite there yet. The vision's being, the next one, this is great to see. About a quarter of the attendees, the organization is fully aligned on a clear vision. And then we have around 20% each with the vision being crafted, but not all the stakeholders are being involved. And unfortunately, some that have little alignment. So that's where we are with that one. So the next question is a little bit of a tease for our next webinar, which is going to be on September 14th, and that is focused on holiday 2022. I talked a little bit about that one, but we have some great speakers lined up. And the question is, how prepared is your business for the upcoming holiday gifting season? So very simple, very prepared, somewhat prepared, still working on holiday plans. Eek, we haven't started preparing yet. This one's pretty well distributed. Fortunately, very few of you, only 7% haven't started preparing. But kind of what you would expect, around 29% are very prepared. Same number for somewhat prepared, and highest number still working on holiday plans, which sounds about right with the beginning of August. All right, so now we kind of have a sense of where everybody is. Why don't we bring the panel in and get started with the panel discussion? All right, Michelle, Matt, Rich, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. And thank you again, Kelly, for the presentation. So I wanted to get started with some introductions so we know who everyone's here. I want to have each of you just do a quick introduction of who you are, any quick highlights on your background, and then a description of a situation where you found yourself dealing with technical debt and something that you learned from it. So we'll start with Michelle.
You're on mute.
Sorry, I was protecting everybody from my animals. Of course, you start with me. My story about tech debt management can be somewhat lengthy, but for my background, I have an engineering degree and an MBA in finance, but I've spent the majority of my career as a CIO in various retail companies, some off and on responsible for e-commerce operations as well. Most recently, J. Crew and Taylor, Warnaco, Brooks Brothers, a variety of apparel retailers. And most of the time, one of the comments I want to make about tech debt is that it doesn't just happen for bad practice. It happens to good people. And I think Kelly did a really good job of explaining all the reasons that tech debt happens. But in the ongoing pressure to deliver results and the ongoing shifting in the market and the economy, there's always pressure to deliver product fast. And the nature of the beast is that you tend to deliver things as quickly as you can. If you're smart and if you can, you will refactor along the way. And someone had asked the question about what % of time you dedicate to that. I like to dedicate myself 10 to 20% of that. But we've been in situations where we had to do a complete rewrite of sites. And also some good advice Kelly gave was buying components instead of building everything. And that can be a good way to start to refactor your site in a way that eliminates big swaths of tech debt pretty quickly. But the most important thing, I think, is to have that clear collaboration and prioritization with your marketing and business partners so that everybody understands the business reason for addressing tech debt and build it into their plans in a very transparent and open way.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Rich?
Yeah. So I guess I'll start off right now. Currently, I'm CTO of commerce within Capgemini. So we get a view of many companies who are building their commerce ecosystem. And so technical debt is a big, important conversation that happens. I've been, in consulting for about 12 years now, but I spent a lot of time on the retail side dealing with technical debt. I think the one thing that's super important now, so we just spent 2 years in the pandemic phase quickly and rapidly pushing out features to address our customers, right? Whether you're in a retail or you're manufacturing, you wanted to capture that e-commerce revenue. And so we've seen a lot of technical debt built up, both not only on the customer experience side, but on the employee experience side. And so now you've got, suboptimal paths for your employees that you have to think about. And, of course, your customers are dealing with this. And so that technical debt that has built up, a lot of companies are looking at, how do I improve that so I can save on labor, so I can get features out? And I think Kelly hit a good point there. There are some organizations that have got to the point where they're in an ability to release because they've built up so much technical debt and caused various release issues. And that's important, I think. So we've, in our conversations, and one of the things I have is a group that focuses on solution architecture of how across the entire digital ecosystem. And as we see that, we see opportunities to help them really componentize their architecture. And, we talk about, composable capability, but you can really start to say, how do I break out the heaviest pieces of technical debt and buy a solution that sets the bar that helps me, remove some of that. And maybe some of it is refactoring, but there's so many opportunities now, especially with the latest set of architectures. Kelly goes back years of ATG and Oracle, and we all have that experience. But I think, now the architecture has gotten a little bit more fluid, and with these newer solutions, you can bring in, things that will help with your technical debt.
Great. And Matt Powell, CTO of FTD.
So hi, I'm Matt. I'm the CTO of FTD, which if you're over 40 and on the call, you've heard of and think of as a big company. If you're under 40, you haven't. FTD was, I started in April 2020, so 1 week after Illinois, where FTD is based, went shelter in place. And following a private equity purchase of the company out of bankruptcy. But before that, FTD today, 112 years old, it invented the wire service concept. So all the great people of today, like Western Union and American Express and Visa, all this stuff, that entire concept was invented by 13 florists in 1910 who had this incredible idea at the time, which is use the conventional the common communication tech of the day, the telegraph, to create a new revenue stream for small businesses by allowing their customers to send gifts to people in other places, and a solution to the problem of the fact that nobody ever thinks to give gifts early enough to consumers, so that you could send a gift to somebody who lived hundreds of miles away, same day, next day, even in 1910. We do about 7 million orders a year on our platform. I'm responsible for everything from e-commerce to SaaS to our marketplace and logistics businesses. So it's a big footprint. And FTD, in addition to being the inventor of the wire service concept, was a first and early mover to the internet. And as near as I can tell, that's where the lion's share of the innovation stopped in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And so my job is unwinding several decades of tech debt. It's like where I live. It's pretty much all I think about all day, every day. And trying to do that on a private equity timeline during a pandemic and, oh, by the way, in a recession. So I'm excited for this conversation because it is literally my obsession.
All right. So I'm going to start with an audience question that came in from George Hitler. And he was asking about the percent of capacity a product team should dedicate each sprint to tackling tech debt, and mentioned that it's this constant battle. The dev teams want more time, business wants zero time. I think, Michelle, you said 10 to 20%. I don't know, Matt, Kelly, or Rich, I'm kind of curious if you feel like, do you think of it in terms of like a percent of capacity, or maybe we'll start with you, Matt, since you said that you've been thinking of, you kind of like dedicating yourself to reducing tech debt. So how do you allocate resources to doing that versus, launching new products to move the business forward?
So I think it's situational a little bit. So I think if you have a mature organization, a mature platform, 10, 20%, probably closer to the 10% side is about right. At the same time, I think everything is a cost benefit analysis. The way you deploy your resource is basically, for me, it's priority, level of effort, and investment all the time. And so the question is always, what's the biggest bang for the buck in a zero-sum game? I think that relies on a really strong cross-functional partnership outside of tech with the other affected parties. Otherwise, you can't have that conversation. But in my belief, in my experience, the best possible outcome is for the tech organization to be able to clearly articulate what a specific piece of tech debt that wants to be attacked is, why it matters in language that the partners across the business can understand, and to work together to stack rank and prioritize those things on the best opportunity for a return on a short-term and long-term basis. That's really hard to do if teams don't have trust and they haven't built a kind of a shared language, as Kelly talked about. But if they have, it gets really exciting, because what starts to happen then is your partners outside of tech are saying things like, it'd be great to build this thing, and we might make an incremental X amount of EBITDA now. But if we do this other thing, the next 24 months look amazing. So let's do this other thing, because this thing is a long-term thing that's been in the way. So I tend to think a rule of thumb of percentage is good, but if you can get to the point where you're having an impact-based conversation, that's better.
If I could add something as well, it really depends also where you are in your business life cycle. And if you're building a new startup from scratch, say you're building a new direct-to-consumer startup app, right? You probably want to spend very little time servicing your debt, and you want to get something to market very quickly. So you accumulate your debt and you get something to market, and everything's great. Also, if you're on the end of that, right, and you're, say working on the ETG platform at Oracle now, and it's been sunsetted, and the product doesn't have more than 6 months of support or whatever it is, at that point, should you probably be servicing debt? No. If you're working for an old school retail chain that's been taken over and sucked dry by a private equity firm, and they're not investing in the future, like, does it make sense to really invest in tech debt? Not really, but if you found product market fit and you're taking something to market, and you've got a long future ahead as a business, it probably makes sense to spend a lot of your time focusing on it. So it really depends where you are in that bell curve of adoption.
Kelly, it's almost like you're thinking about it in a total cost of ownership kind of way, right? And it depends on what your planning horizon is.
Yeah, and
lots of reasons.
And internally, we've talked about it like a car almost, right? And if you get a car and you buy it brand new and you've got 20,000 miles on it and the transmission goes out, you're going to fix it. Right? You've got a lot of life left in that car. But if you buy a really old car with 250,000 miles on it and the transmission goes, you're probably just going to junk it. It just doesn't pay. So,
right, or if you're going to sell your house and it needs a new roof, but it's okay for 2 years, maybe you let the new owners fix the roof.
Correct.
So we had a question come in about KPIs to, I think they said, track tech debt over time. And I think that's actually a pretty good segue into a conversation about the relationship between IT or technology and marketing and the business. In marketing and CX, there's like really simple KPIs like conversion rates and traffic and return on ad spend. Obviously, none of them are that simple because there's always lots of nuances. But I wonder if that might be a way of thinking about like how the IT and marketing should be having conversations. That is there a way that you can find some common definitions or common metrics that are going to apply, in the marketing scheme? So I don't like Michelle. Maybe I'll start with you.
So there's a lot of ways to think about it. It's hard, as you say, you don't have a direct KPI of tech debt. It is a little bit hard to measure, but it manifests in a lot of different ways. And again, a lot of them Kelly mentioned, right? It slows down the performance of your site. There's quantifiable metrics about what additional response time does to your conversion and your market basket size. But it also slows down your engineering velocity. So it can have a significant impact on the time it takes you to deliver features and functions. And I think if you look at it in terms of where is the site breaking? Where is the site experiencing stress in performance, either in the time that it takes to respond or in breakage and issues? That can help you focus on the areas that require refactoring and attention to tech debt at a higher level. It's not exactly a metric, but that's how I tended to think about it.
I don't know, Rich or Matt, anything you want to add there?
Yeah,
It works?
So in organizations that are very technically driven and they've got a process around it, we do see where there's new bugs introduced and how much is coming through the pipeline. Or we see a lot around code quality. And as you drive up code quality, you can start to see the technical debt. But most people and most organizations that have a business to IT relationship, they show how much of their dedicated resources that they're doing not servicing the business. And that is really like an eye opener sometimes. And I think Kelly hit it right on the head. Is when you have these outdated systems or you failed to upgrade or you've continued to kind of ride the wave, that technical debt starts to increase, and those hours that you're dedicating to maybe it's patches or other things seem to spiral out of control. And so that ratio of the amount of hours that you're servicing that is not going towards the business objectives, it seems to be a good way. But even on there are tools, of course, that do code coverage and basically your code quality. Even in those, I think a lot of companies, when they're almost like purely technical, they think that, and maybe it's your Silicon Alley group or or Valley, and I come from New York, so we had a Silicon Alley, of course, in New York. But I think you see a very methodical way of measuring that, and that's it really has to be about how much you're servicing the business.
Yeah, my only little add to that is just to make it one simple way that we look at it. It's like a very easy metric. That's, I think, a version of what we're just talking about is build versus run. How much of the team's time and resource and expense and all that is going toward building new versus running existing platforms. If you get more into the nerdery, I tend to like looking at size of code base for a particular product, because code should not scale linearly with functionality. What you ought to see is that the size of the code base gets periodically reduced, or that the shape of growth changes, because that's how you can see refactoring happen. And what tends to happen is as we expand the capability of something, what we find is the architecture needs to shift. And when the architecture shifts, what you should see is a throttling of the size of the code required to deliver the capability, because you better understand what the foundational idea that you're trying to solve is. So that's a place to look if you've got your like glasses and pocket protector on. And then I think the other metric that we track is we'll tag tickets and stories in our like agile environment with whether or not it was something that shouldn't have to exist, because we have so much legacy surface area that we end up having to write a lot of code to accommodate the legacy environment that we know full well when we write it is just drag on the overall system. And so I can quantify that metrically and be like, okay, this percentage of this team's time went to this. The team's capitalization rate is this. It's worth X number of, like one of my teams spends $600,000 a year writing around a legacy system. Straight EBIT, right? So there are hard quantifications too.
So I think Kelly brought up tags during his presentation, and we have our own little speaker chat, and that got pretty excited. So, and then there was a question that came in from the audience about, how do you hold solution providers accountable for the size of the pixels and the code that there's injected into the site? So maybe, I don't know, first of all, I mean, I'm wanted to turn it over to the panel of, are there some things that you've been doing that are addressing this buildup of tags and the impact it has on performance and load time and things like that? And then, is there any way to shift some of that responsibility to the solution providers? So Rich, do you want to start there?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think tags are tough. I mean, it's in various organizations, it's managed differently. They see different priorities, and they use it for different functions, right? I mean, some it's on the analytics side, or you're trying to maybe just overwrite content. The one thing we see, and I think it's important, is measurement's key. Like constantly measuring the user experience is key, and making sure that as you introduce new tags, as you introduce new components, you're not impacting, because we all know, and we should all be aware, I think is that any impact to the customer experience, delivery time, will impact your conversion, right? And so, but from a tag standpoint, we see measurement as key. There's nothing contractually that we've ever seen that can hold a tag provider responsible, right? And you can at times to say if their service is not, but if there's payload size, or there's, and again, you got to protect yourself. But this is a tough subject. I think we could spend up another webinar just on tag management and the methodology to help drive this. I think we all had a little chat going on, right, about this.
The thing I added in the chat was it's full life cycle tag management. It always seems like most companies spend a lot more thought into what tag to add and don't really go back and think about which ones to remove.
Yeah, and if you step back and look at it, I mean, economics has had this classic problem forever, which is tragedy of the commons. And, one person littering a piece of property, the margin of litter by one person is basically zero. But if you multiply that by thousands of people over the course of, a year, pretty quickly that parcel of land becomes ugly and useless and uninhabitable. And it's the same thing with air pollution. Any one factory isn't spewing enough pollution to cause a problem, but collectively, when you've got 7 billion people around the world or whatever it is, you've got a problem. And it's the same thing with, sorry, this is a terrible analogy, but it's the same thing with tags and with tech debt. The actions of any one developer probably aren't terribly material, but when you have 20, 30, 40, 50 developers all introducing each their own tag with a 3% overhead, pretty quickly you have a problem. And that's, in economics, that's why governments are called for, because they're able to look above the interests of any one individual and implement policies to look after scarce resources. And that's where managers, on this webinar, need to step up and create some form of process. I don't think it has to be terribly heavy-handed, but we should set a tag budget and say, look, we can do 5 of these. That's it, right? If you add another one, you got to find another one to remove. And that's where these architecture review boards come from, where they meet once a quarter and review high-level decisions.
I would kill to only have 5 tags. Like, wow, five tags would be the best bar ever, right?
You meant 50.
Yeah.
But you've got to step up as a manager and not give into that and what we found at commercetools to work really well is trade-offs. So when we roadmap, we'll put all of the high-level features, and we'll have a line that says we're going to do it next year or not. And each one has, a fixed value, and we let the product managers trade, basically. you know, and because you can't do it all. You just can't. You have to make trade-offs. And it's the same thing with tags. It's the same thing with everything. So you've got to budget, quantify for it, budget, and make product folks take the hard decision.
The key in those active sprints is to review the area that you're enhancing to see what's no longer needed and what's inefficient, and make that part of the project and build that into the estimates and have everyone aligned on the expectation for what delivery is going to be.
And reward people for it. If somebody removes a big chunk of code, they should be celebrated in the same way or more than if they deliver some cool new feature. People like the new and shiny.
And I think the point for tags, I think, is true for everything, which is like it's about active management and recognizing that these things are assets, and assets need to be cultivated and gardened. And the problem with a lot of this stuff is they're treated lazily, right? And I think part of the problem with tags is they're treated lazily by partners, simply because it's easier that way, right? The whole goal is like we want to make it. We don't want the development team to have to get involved in adding a capability to your website or tracking. So what do? We put a low performance tag out that's really easy to implement. And so like, I think it also goes back to this topic of like managing the whole thing in alignment with business partners to understand, yes, sure, it's great that we can run X, Y, or Z tests or use this new partnership and get this data from it. But the laziness of the tag implementation is a cost that we all bear. And so how do we make those decisions together? Because there's also options. I was saying in the chat, like important tags that perform like shit, we just look at how to implement them differently. Not every tag needs to know what's happening in the session. So we'll asynchronously feed tag data to a partner on the back end from the OMS to avoid gumming up the session with it. Like there's all sorts of things you can do. So it's the same, it's a piece of everything else, right? Which is like prioritization, impact, partnership, alignment.
But yeah, so Michelle, I wanted to switch to you, and maybe we can like wrap up with a couple comments on this. But you made a comment during the prep call about the importance of like having this clear vision and how this can, I don't want to put words in your mouth and say that it solves the problem, but I think it's I think you were characterizing it as a move in the right direction. Maybe you could just talk a little bit about that and why that makes such a difference. And then I'd be interested to hear from the other panelists any reaction to that, and then we can wrap up.
Sure. I've worked several places where we came from a monolith and moved to a more flexible architecture. And I think having a North Star, both for where you're trying to get to from an architecture perspective and for what you want to get to from a customer support, how you're going to measure customer satisfaction and what you're really trying to do. Because we all have KPIs, right? But some of them are in conflict, right? Are you trying to maximize traffic? Are you trying to maximize conversion? Are you trying to maximize cart? To some extent, those things don't all work together with high margins and proper inventory utilization and all those other things that we're trying to balance at the same time. So if you can relate all of the different functionality enhancements that you get from the business with the overall goal for where you're driving the site, with an overall understanding of the platform that you want to end up on, with a degree of flexibility, with the open architecture, with an API-based microservices structure, with a headless commerce front end, with all of the things that you're trying to get to, it becomes a lot easier to make those trade-offs in a transparent and partnership-driven way with all the stakeholders that have an interest in the performance of the site.